Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century. This comes from the American Pageant, 16th edition. So the chapter starts off with the Chesapeake Bay Region. You see a map over to the right of the Chesapeake Bay Region. Now, the Chesapeake Bay is a very difficult area to live in. There's frequent malaria, dysentery, and typhoid. Most of the people in Virginia and Maryland didn't even make it to see the age of 20. So that goes to show you how tough this region truly is. The region depended on new settlers from England due to this massive amount of people dying young. And most of the people who lived in this region are men. Men outnumber women in the 1650s 6-1, and by the end of the century it does get significantly better, but it's still 3-2. So this creates a very unstable, shaky family structure in the region. Most of the girls, or many of the girls, were pregnant before they get married. You're taking a look at 33% in Maryland. So that just kind of it shows us the shaky nature of the family structure in the region. However, since many people did die young, property rights were very liberal. Inheritance rights were also very liberal for women in the Chesapeake Bay region. It tends to get better as time goes on, though. People begin to develop immunities to the diseases, and by 1700 Virginia is the largest and most populous of the colonies, even ahead of Massachusetts and Maryland. Tobacco is the king cash crop of the region. Maryland, Virginia, the upper part of North Carolina are participating in tobacco production, but tobacco is very hard on the soil. Tobacco exhausts the nutrients from the soil very readily, and this causes people to move inland. When people move inland, they meet up with Native Americans, and hostilities begin to grow. By 1700, the region is exporting nearly 40 million pounds of tobacco per year, which is a significant amount. There you go. In order to make all of that tobacco, however, we need a large labor supply, and that's something that isn't prevalent very early on. Okay, there are labor shortages in the region, so indentured servitude is begun to fill the labor shortages in the Chesapeake Bay. An indentured servant is a worker who gives up 7 to 11 years of his life working for a plantation owner, basically. And these indentured servants are coming from England. Now, the employer pays for the boat ride to the New World. They are given clothes, provisions, and a job upon arrival, but they're not given land. Indians made very poor slaves because they died very quickly from disease, and African slaves are too expensive early on. So this is the way that Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina as well kind of takes care of the labor shortages, but it does run into some problems. It does cost money to get people over here, so incentives must be made for plantation owners to attract indentured servants. So what the government of the colonies did was to pay the plantation owners an extra 50 acres of free land for every indentured servant that they brought over. The outcome of that is over 100,000 indentured servants come to the region, making many plantation owners very, very wealthy, and their plantations extremely large. This is going to cause problems later on, but we have some very wealthy plantation owners here. In fact, the immigrants that came to Virginia and Maryland in the 1600s, 75% of that group are indentured servants. Unfortunately, once the indentured servant becomes free, they don't have much money and they don't have any land. Also, since the plantation owners had so much land, there isn't any land to buy. So a lot of these indentured servants were forced to move to the frontier. And when they did that, they ran into Native Americans. And these Native Americans were very hostile, and many of these indentured servants were attacked. This created a lot of anger amongst those settlers who moved west, because they are Virginia natives, or citizens, and they want the Virginia government to help them. They call to the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley, to help, but Berkeley refuses any help. So Bacon gets a group of about 1,000 of these former indentured servants, and they march on the capital of Virginia. They burn the capital down, and they also take out some big plantation homes and farms. Now, the rebellion is put down, and we don't see any great success for the former indentured servant. An unfortunate result is that the Virginia government decides that indentured servitude may not be the answer, and it kind of forces them, or gives them the idea to start participating in the slave trade. Now, the colonial slave trade, we've learned a lot about before in other courses and in middle school, but so a lot of this should come as no surprise. But the slave trade is a very gruesome, brutal part of American history. European traders went to the west coast of Africa, picked up slaves there, took them to the New World where the slaves worked on plantations. They grew tobacco. Later on, they would grow cotton and rice. And these products would go back to Europe and would make the European traders a lot of money. The plantation owners are making a significant amount of money as well, and a few tribal leaders in Africa are getting rich. Some interesting numbers to note here: half of Virginia's population by 1750 are slaves, and it's even higher in South Carolina, where the slave population outnumbers the white population 2 to 1. Very significant numbers. Of course, we've learned about triangular trade in courses such as World History, AP World, AP Euro, and this is how it goes down. You see a map here to the right, a situation that I just explained. One of the toughest parts of the slave trade is the Middle Passage, the boat ride from Africa to the New World. This is an extremely harsh, long, brutal boat ride for the African slaves. Many people died on the Middle Passage trying to get their way to the New World, or being forced to the New World by the slave traders. The slave population of the Chesapeake Bay region, and the South too, eventually begins to perpetuate itself by its own natural reproduction. Slaves are creating children through natural reproduction, and these children are becoming slaves themselves. The economic structure, the social structure of the South creates a very vast wealth gap. The planter elite is considered to be the upper 1%. The backcountry farmer, the landless tenant farmer, the servant, and the enslaved African slaves are very poor. So it's not great in the South for anybody except that upper 1%. That's what a lot of people don't really think about. The wealth gap is extreme. Now, obviously, the slave in the South has it the worst, but the landless tenant farmer and the backcountry farmer also have it extremely tough. The South is not a fun place to live. We take a look at New England in quite a bit different light. New England has a very high life expectancy. The climate there is much cooler, and the water there is much cleaner than what they had in the middle colonies and the southern colonies. So there's not near the amount of disease. In fact, European immigrants that come to the New England colonies live 10 years longer than the people in Europe. As a matter of fact, the first generation of Puritan colonists lived to be about 70 years old. That's very surprising for a lot of people. Entire families tended to immigrate, so there is a significant amount of females in New England. Therefore, there's a significantly high birth rate. Women were typically married in their early 20s and had a baby every other year until menopause. Now, that's a significant amount of childbirth for a woman. In fact, the governor, William Phipps, was one of 27 children born to the same mother. New England life was very stable, but it was also extremely conservative. Premarital pregnancy was very uncommon, as was divorce. Very few ways you could get divorced in this region. One of them would be abandonment of your spouse. If your spouse just runs off and never comes home, you were allowed to get a divorce. And if your spouse was adulterous, that could also be grounds for divorce as well. Women who were adulterous were oftentimes forced to wear the red letter A on their clothing, signifying that they were an adulterer. This practice was made famous through the novel The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of America's classic works of literature. Most New Englanders lived in small villages and farms, and the land that was given out and sold was done so in a very fair fashion. There wasn't a lone wolf planter, so to speak, who took up all of the land. Land was distributed equally, and life for the most part in New England was much happier, and the wealth was distributed much more evenly in this particular region. One of a significant democratic values that New England had was its town meetings. Now, these town meetings were called by Thomas Jefferson as the best school of political liberty the world has ever saw. They met regularly, typically at the church or community center, to elect officials, appoint schoolmasters, discuss road repairs, topics that were very meaningful to the local government. Not only was the town meetings very interesting, education was also very interesting. Literacy rates amongst adults in New England were nearly 50%, and that's an extremely high number for this year, for that time period. It's very important for us to note that towns that had 50 or more families were forced to provide elementary education to the children. This compulsory education is a lasting reason why the New England school system is still heads and shoulders above many of the other places in our country. Harvard was established in 1636, which proves the value of education was well advanced and well ahead of the middle colonies and the southern colonies. The first southern university, William and Mary, was not established until 1693. Obviously, the Puritan religion is extremely important in New England, but it began to lose its zeal as the population rises and immigration begins to take hold in the region. So, with church membership falling, it became apparent that something needed to be done. What happened is they passed an idea called the halfway covenant. And prior to this halfway covenant, in order to become a member of the church, both your parents had to be a Puritan. Well, as membership began to decline, they decided to kind of lax this policy so that children of unbaptized Protestants and non-Protestant people could actually be baptized and join the Protestant church. Now, these people don't get full membership of the church, but they are respected in the community, and it's much better than previous. The Puritan zeal does ring very true in the New England colonies, and an unfortunate event in history occurs in 1692 with the Salem witch hunts. 19 people were hanged and one was pressed to death during the Salem witch hunts. 2 dogs were even hung. Witch hunts were extremely common in Europe at that time. The accused were typically property-owning women and older women, and those from Salem town, which was more economically thriving than Salem village. We discussed this at great length in class, so I don't believe we need to go further into that. As a general rule, the New England people were extremely hardworking. They were very inventive and intelligent. They were also very frugal, which means to be conservative with your money. They were also known to be fairly stubborn, but that's not always a bad thing. The New England colony was not very abreast of farming on a large scale, so due to the fact that the soil was extremely rocky and less fertile in the South. Now, families did grow gardens of their own, but large-scale farming was not present. Therefore, plantation ownership does not take hold in this particular region. Therefore, slavery does not take hold in this region. Now, the economy of New England depended primarily on fishing, shipbuilding, and commerce, trade. And these are also not ventures that necessitate a large slave supply. So the New England colonies don't participate in large-scale slave trade. Many New Englanders were fishermen off the coast of Newfoundland, and those are some of the best fishing grounds in the world. I hope this presentation has helped you understand Chapter 4. If you have any questions, please comment, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Good luck in the rest of the year. We'll see you in Chapter 5.